Hello, I'm Anthony. I've been having a deep dive into the magical world of borrowed chords in recent weeks. As with many subjects of music theory, it's one of those things that leaves you a little bit uncomfortable when you learn about the principle of borrowed chords, and we're going to talk about them in great detail today. You're told these general principles that really don't make very much sense. And if I don't understand a thing, I can't use it in a proper musical context. I'm not interested in learning a dry theory from a textbook. I want to learn something that can genuinely help me to write interesting music. And so I've approached the subject of borrowed chords from exactly that perspective. I want to understand it sufficiently well to be able to use it really musically when I'm writing a song and not just repeating something parrot fashion because a textbook's told me to do so. Now I'm going to be using a tool of mine to help me show you these principles today. This application called Guitar Tutor was written by me. It's freely available to my patrons and channel members. If you want to check out the links below, you can download a copy of this thing, because in the latest version of Guitar Tutor, version 2.9, I've implemented borrowed chords in the application, so I'm going to be using that today. So here's the concept of borrowed chords, as you're likely to see it in the textbook. If you harmonise the scale of C major, you get a group of 7 chords. If you have a look in this little chord chart down below, those are the 7 chords of the C major scale. And today I'm just going to concentrate on 3 of them. I'm going to use the C major, which is the 1 chord, F major, which is the 4 chord, and G major, which is the 5 chord. The principle of borrowed chords tells you that you can jump over to the minor scale and borrow any of these chords, and they'll sound good in the context of a major key. So instead of playing those 3 major chords now, I'm going to play G major, F minor, C major. And in fact, I can play any variation of minors or majors, and they're all going to work. Some are going to work better than others. We've always got to use our ears as the final arbiter, but the general principle is pretty strong. So let's go minor, major, major. And it is more interesting. It adds that extra colour because you're using chords that you're not used to hearing in the context of a C major key. Probably the all-time greatest exponent of borrowed chords were the Beatles. So many of their songs used them. And a common trick that they used to do was to play the major chord immediately followed by the minor chord. And it just sounds absolutely beautiful. That minor chord has no place in the key, but it's awesome. So there's borrowed chords for you, lifted straight out of a textbook. And you think, okay, that's great. I'm certainly going to use that in my songwriting. But a thought that occurred to me was, well, what about all of the other modes? Because there are 7 modes of the C major scale, and we've only discussed the 1st and the 6th, the major and the minor modes. Major's a weird word. We can call it the Ionian mode if we like, but really it's the 1st mode of the major scale. Are we allowed to use chords from the other modes? Well, rather than answering yes or no, how about we kind of try to have a look under the hood of the principle to figure out why this is working? The reason I'm able to substitute minor chords for major chords in each one of those examples is because there's a great degree of commonality between those 2 chords. When I switch from G major to G minor, the root and the 5th, the 2 strongest harmonic notes of the chord, remain absolutely consistent. I'm playing G and D every time. The only note that I'm moving is the B to a B flat. And so the strength of the tonic and the perfect 5th is helping to support that chord, so that when I introduce the minor, it still sounds like it's from the same family, and my ears allow me to perform that translation. In fact, they like it, because we enjoy that little bit of tension of hearing slightly unexpected notes in an otherwise very common context. So the thought then occurred to me, well, just concentrating on the G chord for a moment, if I run through all 7 modes, what variations of G am I playing as the 5th? In other words, what's the 5 chord of every one of these modes? So if we start off with major, and you have a look at this box down here, you can see we've got a G major there. If I switch to Dorian, we've got a minor. The Phrygian mode has a G diminished, major, minor, and finally the Locrian mode has a G flat. So which of those chords am I allowed to use as a borrowed chord? Well, there's absolutely no law. I can use any of them if I want to, and if you work hard enough, you're going to be able to make it kind of make sense in some sort of context. But if you start from the basic principle of keeping as much stability in the original chord as possible, then you actually define a rule set that allows you to pare down that list of chords to something that's more usable. So if we go back to the major mode, now I'm going to click on this little square with the G chord in. Guitar Tutor's done some calculations in the background there, and it's figured out that the only one of those variant chords, as we ran through all of the different modes, the only one where the majority of the chord is stable and a single note moves is G minor. All of those other chords, for example, if I play a G diminished, which is G, B flat, D flat, I've moved 2 notes. Both the B and the D have descended a semitone. So according to my own completely arbitrary, kind of personally defined rule set, I'm going to abandon that as a candidate borrowed chord because it doesn't have sufficient commonality with the original G major chord. I'm going to say that the only borrowed chords that I'm going to use are those that only move one single note from the basic root chord of the parent key. So G minor is my only permissible option. Let's have a look at F now and see if that's the same story. Well, it isn't. Here we've got 2 candidate borrowed chords. We've got the F minor that we've already seen. It came from the Aeolian mode. As it happens, it's also coming from the Phrygian and Locrian modes, but we don't really care. There's 3 different modes of the C major scale that are, in quotes, allowing us to play a G minor. But there's another chord as well, G flat diminished. If you have a look at the notes of G flat diminished, you can see them in the upper keyboard. We have a G flat, an A, and a C. Well, the A and the C are both in F major. I've raised the F 1 semitone to get to G flat diminished, and that's following my own internal rule, only moving 1 note. So can I borrow G flat diminished from the Lydian mode of the C major scale? So now let's play with those candidate chords. I've got G major, G minor, F major, F minor, and now I've introduced a G flat diminished as well. G major, G minor, G flat diminished, F major, down to C major. The reason why I think that worked pretty well is because I went from 1 minor chord, the G minor, down to a G flat diminished, which is effectively a minor chord. The difference between the root and the third of a diminished chord is a minor third interval. So it's really a minor chord. It should kind of be called G minor diminished, but we truncate it. So putting those 2 minor chords together, even though they share no common tones, sound okay because they're both from the same family. They're both from the minor family. It doesn't quite sound as good if I rub a G major against that G flat diminished. There's my G major into G flat diminished, into an F major, into a C major. So I pulled it back with those last 2 chords because they sound very harmonious. They're both in the key of C major. But the stuff that I'm trying to use, the borrowed chords, didn't work quite so well when I went from major to a borrowed diminished. So time to just take a step back and have a think about what's going on here. We're borrowing chords from any of the modes of the scale, and we're using a rule that says we're only going to borrow a chord from any of the other parallel keys if we move 1 single note with respect to the basic kind of standard key of the scale. In addition, when we're moving from one chord to another, we're trying to use some familial relationship. In an ideal world, we want as many of the notes to retain commonality between the chords as we pass down the progression. But if we can't do that, at least we're going to use the same familial relationship. 1 minor chord to another minor chord helps us to get over this stress of hearing a diminished chord, which is quite a tension-laden chord in the first place. I'm also using voice leading to come down from the G minor, which has the root G, obviously, down to a G flat diminished, so I've stepped down one semitone. Then I come down another semitone to the F major. Let's add a colour chord in now, we'll borrow the F minor. And then finally resolve down to C major. And there's also nothing stopping you borrowing chords from the tonic. But there is a problem with calling these borrowed chords, because if you finish off the pattern on a C minor, that's the point of resolution. And so it's very strongly suggesting that you've actually modulated to C minor now. You're no longer in the key of major. So yes, you can do it, but you've got to be careful not to accidentally fall into a C minor, which is also completely fine. You know, there's nothing wrong with any of this. We're just talking about general principles. So any chord sequence that finishes on a C minor, let's throw a quick one in. G major, F minor, to C minor. That's either using two borrowed chords or we're kind of straying into the territory of C minor now. So generally speaking, when I'm thinking about using borrowed chords, I'm less likely to do it with the tonic than any of the other chords, because it so strongly points you in the direction of just a straightforward key modulation. That's a different thing, not what we're talking about today. So with that said, let's stick all of our resolutions back on a C major and have a bit more of a play with the F and the G. Is there anything else that we can do that's interesting up there? If we extend to 4-note chords and we introduce the 7th as well, we get a whole new host of interesting options. So the 5 chord in C major, which is G7, has two possible alternatives. I can play with the 7th to make it a G major 7. Let's bring that up on the keyboard. There's the 7th being raised to a G flat. Or I can play with the 3rd. I can drop the B down to a B flat and play a G minor 7. So I'll play a little variation now that uses all three of those chords. I'll start with the G major 7 because that has the highest of the notes. Then I'll bring that G flat down to an F to play the G7. Finally, I'll drop the 3rd to play a G minor 7. So this is where we'll start. Down to G7. And that's the G minor 7. Let's go down to an F major. F minor. But of course, we've got interesting colour chords in the F family as well. This time we have a right motley crew. There's my F major 7. I have an F7. But I also have a G flat half diminished. So now I want to cherry pick the best of those borrowed chords to come out with my final pattern. And that'll do us for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you next time. Thanks very much.